understanding that we have a silent pandemic. The silent pandemic is about the fact that we have bacteria, which is life-threatening, which is becoming immune, which is losing which is becoming resistant to the medicines that we take. And that is really something that we as human beings are getting to be very, very worried about and must. It's an issue of global concern. It's an issue that needs to bring governments together, people together, doctors together, because we understand the role of antibiotics, antimicrobials in modern medicine. So that's one part of the silent pandemic that we know of. But increasingly, there are two other challenges that we are beginning to understand. One, the issue of access. So countries like mine, countries like India have a double challenge. We have a challenge on one hand to make sure that AMR, antimicrobial resistance, does not increase, because we are too poor a country that we cannot afford to treat people based on the medicines we give them. On the other hand, we need access. We need access to these medicines. And that's one other part of the challenge. The third part of the challenge is the fact that the pipeline, and this is a word that I have become very familiar with over this last 9 months, the pipeline of antibiotics, the innovation that is needed to bring new medicine on the table is drying up. In February, as a member of the Global Leaders Group, of which Haley is here, Dr. Getahun is here to represent, to be with us, we discussed the issue of the shrinking pipeline. And that became an issue that brought all global leaders together to say, this is something of very deep concern. Why is it happening? Why is it that we as governments are not able to put in the money that is needed for innovation? Why is it, and I'll be very blunt about this, why is it that industry, pharma industry, which is making huge profits, is not investing in the drugs that are needed and bringing it to the market? Because we also learned that there is innovation that is there particularly in small companies, but it's not getting to the market. Now, this is clearly an issue of importance, an issue that deserves our attention. So what we at CSE, Center for Science and Environment, have done, and my colleague Amit Khurana, who is leading this work, will discuss it with you now, is to try and deconstruct what is happening. And try and bring the conversation together. We are doing this because we know that GLG is taking forward this agenda, and we do believe that GLG is a very critical global forum to be the voice, to ask and to demand for change. But to demand for change means that we must understand, what do we want? What are the issues? And so for that, what we at CSE have done over these last 9 months is to, in a sense, synthesize what is happening, to put together a state of art, and from that have a series of conversations with experts to understand what is the way ahead. This conversation today is, in a sense, what we are calling the final of our 4-part series, to bring together the leading experts in the field, the innovator, the regulator, the policy, the developer, people who can help to steer us, not in terms of what's the problem, but where do we go from here? This is an agenda-setting webinar to help us to identify what needs to be done, and based on that, to be able to take it with GLG to the global forums and to be able to set out the agenda for change. So before I will introduce the panelists, after I ask my colleague Amit Khurana to give us an overview. Amit, please go ahead.
Yeah, thank you, Sunita. I'll just share the slides that I have. So I hope this is fine. Everybody can see this. Yeah.
Yes, go ahead, Amit.
Okay. So this is what we are discussing. As Sunita just mentioned, this is the antibiotic webinar series, and this is webinar number 4. Now, I think it got stuck. Just give me a minute. Yeah. So this is the journey, if I may say so. Um, so with my colleagues, Rajeshwari and Gauri, we did an assessment of the antibiotic pipeline. We came out with it released in our fortnightly publication called Down to Earth. This was in July 2023. Uh, it was clear that yes, we've got some sense on what are the broad areas that need to be worked upon, and we wanted to know more, engage with stakeholders, and that's where when we decided that yes, uh, we need to engage. So we discussed this over 3 sets of let's say deliberations. And today is actually the time when we are actually releasing in a way, presenting or making public our initial report, which is based on the assessment as well as the key takeaways which have from the 3 sets of discussions that we have had. Now, let's try and see first understand what were the key takeaways from the findings. So we all know global antibiotic pipeline is weak. It is also called fragile, dry, anemic. Only 77 candidates are there in clinical stages. Um, 45 are traditional molecules. The pipeline is stagnant, particularly against the priority pathogens. We know 33 were there in 2017, and now there are about 28. Near-term scenario is bleak, particularly in phase 3. If we see only 9 traditional small molecules are there and none for TB. That's very, very important to note. Long-term scenario is also bleak. It's not really promising. Less than 15% of the 217 preclinical candidates are in advanced stages. If you compare this with the pipeline, let's say, or the medicines in active development in other areas, you would see more than 10,000 are there for cancer, more than 1,800 are there for neuropsychiatric conditions. That's where you can compare where we are going with the antibiotic pipeline. Now, one of the key findings is big pharmaceutical companies are not focusing on antibiotic. We all know that, but let me just say some numbers. We selected 15 high-earning companies and tried to understand their pipelines. Out of 1,017 candidates, only 13 were antibacterial candidates in the clinical pipeline. Only 4 companies were involved in the antibiotic R&D, and 8 out of these 13 molecules are actually being developed by one company, which is GSK. And we could also clearly figure out that many have exited, and some of those were even pioneers in antibiotic R&D. And if you take a look at the collective 2022 revenue of these companies, it was about $750 billion. And quite a substantial amount of money is being spent on the R&D, which is about 17.5% of this, turns out to be about 124 billion. Now, who is filling this gap? And where are the big companies interested in? So we could see that out of the 1,007 molecules, 411 were for cancer, 150 odd for other areas like immunology, allergy, inflammation, or respiratory disease combined, 91 for neurosciences, and you can see a lot for cardiology, metabolism, and similar disease areas. We also figured out that most of the blockbuster drugs, if you see for the last couple of years, are actually in these areas. So it was very clear that this shift in the focus is not just about failure of the market for antibiotics. It's also about the other profitable areas. So who's filling this gap? It's the micro, small, and medium scale companies, but they're also facing challenges. What we could figure out was, there are lots of reports on that. I think WHO also has an analysis which says 84% of preclinical candidates which are being developed, those are from either micro, small, and medium scale companies. We also figured out that many of the companies which are in the clinical stages, they're also small and medium scale companies. And challenges, of course, are related to bankruptcy, diminished value, exits, and many other with reference to development. Now, we suggested some points, some way ahead, and these were broad areas. We could clearly figure out the world needs greater public financing, and of course reforms. Reforms lead to markets, reimbursements, regulatory approvals, cost of new antibiotics, and in clinical trials. Governments need to come together for a coordinated response, and we really need to strike the right balance in public-private partnership. We could clearly see that not many are actually backing that the government should take up all the research. We could also figure out that the other side of the story, that it's the industry who should be supported completely, is also not something that everybody agreed. So we need to strike the right balance here. And of course, there's this lot of discussion happening for the last, particularly at the GLG level, and it's about global public goods. So we could see that perhaps it's time to actually discuss if antibiotics or any other aspect of AMR response can be considered as a global good. Now, these were the experts, if I may, with whom we actually deliberated in trying to understand in a much more detailed way the crisis and potential solutions. And you can clearly see these were very relevant experts. We had James Anderson, who represented the industry. We had Richard from Carbex, who's actually with Carbex, we all know. We have Kevin here today. There's a lot of work on push incentives. We had Leslie from the Global AMR R&D Hub. So what were the key takeaways? Clearly, the crisis of AMR is not limited to the crisis of antibiotic R&D. It's a triple crisis. So I just mentioned about that. These society and healthcare systems place a low value in antibiotics. Despite the high risk, and that in a way also signals to developers that antibiotic R&D is not a priority. Investment in R&D is not a priority. So, and then we also could understand that in addition to being weak, pipeline is actually fragmented. It lacks predictability. Coordination and collaboration is key. In addition to funding, current scale of investment is insufficient. But the funding that we need has to be sustainable. It has to be predictable, and also robust and resilient, which is not impacted by external global negative events. Push incentives are working, but they cannot serve the entire purpose all alone. And the world needs to build on the experience of countries who are right now moving ahead with pull incentives. Targets for new antibiotics are very important, but they got to be abundantly informed by public health needs. There were some suggestions around priority indications list. Priority pathogens list evolving into priority indications list, and a better understanding of the gaps that we have, and better understanding of the desired pipeline that we want to have. And access, of course, is linked with the predictability in demand. Basically, if the companies would know how much is the demand, then perhaps they would be able to serve the access concerns much better. But very importantly, sustainable, and everybody agreed that sustainable and equitable access to antibiotics should be an integral part of all measures. And of course, the GLG is very well poised. They can play a very important role, particularly in view of the 2024 UNGA. Now, coming to a very specific issue, we could really figure out that, yes, the small and medium-scale antibiotic developers who are actually now fulfilling this responsibility, if I may say so, they were facing challenges. So what were those challenges? We wanted to actually discuss this with the Indian antibiotic developers. Here too, of course, we had Bugworks. We know we have Anand here today. So Boston was there at that time. We had Dr. Sachin Bhagwat from Wockhardt. Wockhardt actually has a lot of antibiotics in pipeline. We had Gangajan, who's actually also dealing with the non-traditional candidates. And then, of course, we had Dr. Jitendra, who happens to be from the biotechnology industry and research support group, which actually supports the R&D in India. So he's the managing director of that. So I think we had a very good set of stakeholders for us to be able to understand what were those challenges. So the key takeaways from this was most important was that, yes, we were talking about financial measures, financing initiatives, but it's the non-financial measures which we understood. It was quite enlightening for us in particular that there's a lot that can be done, that can be benefited if we invest more, or if we focus more on the non-financial measures. So, for example, the need to harmonize the global regulatory aspects was very well recognized. Of course, in areas like scientific and technical requirements, and the benefits, of course, would help reduce the duplication of clinical testing and create favorable marketing conditions. There was a discussion about how we need to adopt the accelerated approval pathway. Some countries have that, and of course, how they can spur the innovation. Again, striking the right balance between a viable and a well-differentiated product for a short term and an innovative drug for a long term. There was a lot of discussion about nurturing and conserving the discovery talent, because that is because companies are not investing in it, the talent is actually shrinking. So it's time to nurture them uh, um, and conserve them for long-term innovation, for sustainable long-term innovation. Clinical trials should be supported, of course, through access to networks, patients, and a lot of focus was given on the collaborations between the big and small players, between the academic institutes and the pharmaceutical. And of course, there was this point about that actually, if you talk about big funding, it typically is limited to the situations, or let's say to the pathogens which are of concern in their part of the world, let's say, or at the local level. So this was so then we moved to the third set of webinar discussions. So this was, again, we went back to particularly address the issue of global public good. Now, here too, we had the relevant stakeholders. We had, we had OECD representative, Dr. Kerry. We had Anna from React, who works a lot on these issues in Europe. We had Gavin from US. We had Rohit, and we had Frank from the pandemic fund secretariat. So essentially, a set of stakeholders who could inform us on how and what are the challenges and possibilities with reference to global public goods, or let's say if antibiotics could, or any aspect of antibiotics could be considered as a global problem. Now, what were the key takeaways? Clearly, about the global public goods, it came out that the concept is not new, but presently there's a renewed interest, yes. But the conventional definition of global public goods, which is actually based on non-rivalry and non-excludability, is narrow. It also has its own challenges. There are discussions on other concepts to approach public goods, and one of those is common goods for health. We all know WHO came up with a 2017 paper around that, which not only talked about public financing, but also focused on public action. There's another concept which talked about global functions. Again, it had three dimensions to it: supplying the global public goods, managing cross-border externalities, and exercising leadership to address transnational challenges. But very importantly, it was unanimously, I would say, agreed that antibiotics do not fit the conventional definition of global public goods. But at the same time, there could be different dimensions or characteristics that fit. Antibiotic effectiveness, knowledge, AMR containment, so on and so forth. A couple of interesting points that came in addition to this were about that we need a global collaborative action and global governance. I mean, that is very critical, irrespective of whether we consider antibiotic as a global public good or not. There was also a very interesting point that ultimately every antibiotic might as well become ineffective soon. So we got to adopt a very holistic approach to AMR containment, and perhaps not to overly invest in the antimicrobial development. And this was a very different opinion, but we thought it holds relevance, and we have put it. We move to the so that's where we stand today. This is the report, and I think it is by this time it would be uploaded, so anybody can, for details on our work, it would be referred to.
Thank you, Amit. Thank you, Rajeshwari. Thank you, Gauri. I think fantastic work. Our effort is to synthesize, as I said, and to get the dialogue going, because this is a global challenge, and it's not going to be fixed overnight. But it's also clear to us that we need to be able to move the needle. We need to be able to push much more so that we can get effective action. I have an incredibly powerful panel, and I would like to introduce them and then ask each one of them to share, to give their opening remarks on both what do they see and what do they see as the next stages, next steps moving forward. So first, Haley Gethehun, Haley is the director of the quadripartite Joint Secretariat on AMR. This is in the Division of Antimicrobial Resistance at WHO. Haley is the driving force behind the GLG, bringing us all together and helping us to amplify some very critical issues on AMR at the global stage. I then have Kevin Otteson. Kevin Otteson is the executive director of CARB-X. We have been very fortunate to have his colleagues as part of this dialogue series earlier. CARB-X plays a huge role in providing the funding for many of the startups, many of the innovations that we have seen. And Kevin is the best person to help us to understand where do we go from here. Timothy Jinks is the head of interventions at the infectious disease team of Wellcome Trust. Again, a critical global player in putting forward the agenda on AMR, innovation, and the research that is needed, but also providing the funding for initiatives. So thank you very much, Timothy. And then we have Anand Kumar, who is the CEO and MD of Bugworks Research. And Amit talked about Bugworks. Bugworks is an Indian company, so we feel particularly very proud of you, Anand. Which has been working in this area. And we heard from Anand's colleague in an earlier webinar as well on some of the challenges that they are facing, but some of the opportunities as well. So I think that's really where we have the panel. And as I said, our effort here is to provide a continuing dialogue on this issue, because we know that GLG will take forward this agenda, and we need to make sure that we can understand it much better. Haley, if I may ask you to give your remarks, please. And forgive me, people, I'm kind of congested a bit.
Thank you, Sunita, and thank you also, Amit, for that presentation. I would like to start actually by thanking and congratulating Sunita, your leadership and CSC's engagement in this extremely important topic. We need more voices from civil society on this matter, because we always say it's a silent pandemic. Actually, it's not silent. It's a threat for present and future, of course, and it kills 1.2 million people. I don't need to remind you that. So I really start my remark by taking note of the need to have more civil society voices in this matter. And Amit presented the basics of the data, how the pipeline is inadequate for the challenge we face, and also the issues related you found in your series of webinars and research. And not surprisingly, most of the issues you actually raised are also being discussed in the Global Leaders Group, when it for the first time actually discussed the matter in a much more detail in its first face-to-face meeting in February. And basically said, we are in a crisis of pipeline and access to antibiotics. And this crisis needs a different way and mode of action. So I think that's why the GLG has taken this seriously, and we've been conducting a number of consultations with stakeholders and also with members themselves. How come we can have disruptive and innovative solutions? But having said that, it is also recognizing the efforts that are going on now are actually the best we have. The push and the pull incentive are the best we have at this point in time. But how can we actually make them more robust and more responsive to the massive challenge and the crisis we faced? So this is a rationale, behind the engagement of the Global Leaders Group to push this agenda forward for much more, concrete, action, and more importantly, for solidifying the global voice toward this, where we want to reach. And the private sector's engagement is critically important, and we also recognize the private sector's engagement in the form of the MR Action Fund, and also the role of the small and medium companies is critically important, and the challenge is fully, recognized. And how come we actually, move things forward? And as it came also from your analysis, Sunita, what JLG also found is what we need is that global coordination, global movement, really to coalesce all our voices and actions to this crisis. And in doing so, yes, of course, the issue of putting more public engagement, more engagement of the governments, and also considering the AMR and the antibiotic, antibiotic as global public good is being discussed. Mm-hmm. And the Global Leaders Group chair, Her Excellency Prime Minister Motley, is a champion for this, not only for antibiotic, but in the whole of, especially post-COVID, of the whole idea of bringing more equity to the world. And she is championing for framing antibiotic in those discussions, and particularly in the discussions that she's championing around financing, because financing is critical, and there is a movement of calling for reform of financial institutions, and then we have to discuss how we can also frame antibiotics research and development into those discussions. So these are the type of issues that the JLG would like also to pursue in terms of seizing opportunities that help mobilize the needed resources, which is critically important. Another critical issue is regulatory. And I think there was a data in 25 antibiotics that were developed between 1999 and 2014. I think it was only 12 that were registered in more than 10 countries. This is a massive, massive limitation. And how can we actually improve the access and the regulatory mechanisms of these new antibiotics in such a way that, the appropriate stewardship is also in place, but at least that could also attract and enhance, the market. And that is another critical important what we have to look as a global community. How can we harmonize, and how can we actually also address that major, bottleneck? The other critical issue is also how to galvanize global action. And I know Kevin is organizing this meeting in Malta in February to push for targets, consensus, and as part of our global effort. And I think that will also be critically important. And this is also what the JLG also found as a critical step to bring that global galvanization of action guided by such targets will be critical. And also, as much as we think about antibiotics, we have to also think about the complementary diagnostics, because we need to think positively that we need to save whatever we have and whatever we are going to develop. And also the complementary diagnostic innovation will be critical as well. So this is also the type of line of discussion that is going on, and we will see it. And clearly it will add into the complexity, it will add into the cost. But I think eventually, if we are really looking for disruptive solution, we have to have a comprehensive approach in order to not only develop the antibiotics, but also to preserve and to make sure our existing antibiotics are also continue, working, so that we, of course we need more antibiotics, but we don't need to, expedite that need as well. And lastly, the ANGA high-level meeting, Barbados and Malta are now co-facilitators for that meeting. And we are looking for transformational, specific commitments. And we hope this pipeline and access crisis will get its due attention in that process, and we will get some specific commitments from the world leaders when that matter discussed. With that, I thank you again for the opportunity to be part of this panel.
Thank you. Thank you, Haley. Wonderful. Very wise words, and clearly huge work that we have together to make sure that we can make UNGA a big success this year. Kevin, if I may now turn to you for your remarks.
Thank you, Sunita, for the opportunity to speak today to Center of Science and Environment. And when I think of bacterial infections and the way that it's killing people around the world, this is a complex ecological system. And complex systems have complex outcomes and complex inputs. I think in the US, a famous example is that when they reintroduced wolves into Yellowstone National Park, it changed the grazing patterns of the large animals, which then allowed trees to grow, which along the rivers, which allowed beavers and other animals to re-inhabit that area, which actually changed the course of the rivers over time. It was not an anticipated outcome that reintroduction of wolves would do that. And every time we intervene into the human bacterial space, we create complex outcomes. So we need to be careful and thoughtful and scientific and about our approach. It's a living system. You know, we don't want a world with no bacteria. That would be bad for all sorts of products, but also would be bad for us. If you visit, you know, the American Midwest and fly over it, vast amounts of the terrain are devoted to two crops. It's almost a monoculture. It's maize and soybeans. You know, this has ecological impact and effect. And so, you know, it's a living system, it's a complex system, it's an ecological system. And the result is that, you know, this idea of the common, you know, of a public good or whatnot, I have trouble embracing that exact language, as you well know. We've talked before, but you know, think of this as a common pool resource. This is a lake that we all fish from together. And therefore, we need to be careful not to pollute the lake and not to overfish the lake and not to destroy the lake or to drain it. This is something that humanity, all of us, need to manage collectively so that we can enjoy the benefits from this thing called effective antibiotics, which has been probably the most important drug class in human history. I lead CARB-X. At CARB-X, we're all about the push incentives. So this is one piece of the complex interventions that we need. We're not the only piece by any stretch. There's a lot of things that need to happen here. But what we've done is to support these product developers that are barely spun out of universities, in some cases still at the universities, and to take these ideas and to bring them to the point in which they've completed their first in human clinical trials. Since 2017, which was when we first funded a company, you know, we're one of the political outcomes, I guess, or the you know, the additional things that happened after the UNGA high-level meeting in 2016. Countries who are more interested in push incentives, BARDA and Wellcome Trust got together to form CARB-X and to lead that. But since that time, we've invested in 100 companies, right, with an average of about $3 or $4 million each. 90% of those companies are small or medium enterprises, or there's still research institutes back at the university that have been spun out from them. I have to say, India has outperformed. You have 3 out of those 100 to date, which is better than a number of high-income countries in the world. I'll just say that. So congratulations. Thinking about how do we manage this pull incentive, this push incentive from CARB-X so that it's a common pool resource, so that it benefits all of humanity, so it does what we all need. Well, there's a couple of things. Haley mentioned stewardship and access, the need to make sure the world gets these things. And the model from CARB-X is really, our funders are G7 governments and foundations, charitable foundations like the Wellcome Trust. You know, it's the higher income world subsidizing these things, which then will be available because it's baked into our contractual language. It follows the patent expiration. That anything that's supported by CARB-X has a commitment in there to stewardship and access. We're talking about access right now. The model for how that looks when a product reaches the market, it was murky in 2017, I would say. Today, we have a couple of great examples, both with the participation and leadership of GARD-P. And maybe there'll be other examples too in the near future, but we have now the opportunity to support products that when they get to the market, it won't just be for the shiny hospitals in the high-income world. It's really something that the whole world wants. Why do we support so many? Why 100? Only about 2 or 3% of the things that start at the earliest stages ever make it all the way to market. Anand can attest to the struggle and difficulties and all the other companies that have fallen by the wayside along the way. It's hard. And so we need a full pipeline of highly innovative early products if what we hope to have is a couple of new therapeutics or antibiotics in the future. And then finally, the market, we all like to say the market is broken here, but the market does some good things in other parts of the economy. The market sets priorities, either for good or for ill, because the market chases the money, right? And so that's why we get the things that the market produces. Consumers express their preferences with cash if they have cash, and they buy things. With the antibiotic market, the economics is so broken that somebody else has to set the priorities. It is not the market saying research this bacteria or create this sort of product that will save lives. The market is not sending that signal back. And so it's very, very important that we set these priorities within things like push incentives like CARB-X or pull incentives in the UK or in other countries that prioritize global health needs. So the products we get are not just, again, something for a shiny hospital, but really for the entire world. Out of the 1.27 million that Haley mentioned dying, the great majority of those are in low-income settings. If you just looked at bacterial infection, not just drug resistant, but all bacterial infection, great majority of the deaths are in low-income settings. Everything we ever want to do at CARB-X, we want it to be also applicable everywhere, including those settings. So with that, I think I've probably gone too long. I'm sorry, Sunita.
No, perfect, Kevin. Good. I'm going to come back and push you a little bit, but that's going to be in the second round. Tim, if I may now bring you in, very important voice again. Can you help us to see how do we move forward? What is your experience?
Great. Thank you very much. And thank you for the invitation to participate in this panel, and congratulations to CSE on the work that you've done and the contributions that you've made to help move forward the agenda as relates to how we can best contain AMR. It's great to actually follow collaborators and friends in this discussion. And so I'm going to try to be very brief, and what I'm going to say will resonate, I think, very strongly with what's been said. But as we think about the next steps, I think at a very high level, our priority needs to be that establishing a mandate for change. This is something that is certainly recognized in particular niches and areas, but I think that it's probably very fragile in terms of whether or not there is a firm mandate for change that governments can respond to here. And this is something that I think is a critical ingredient in order to be able to make progress. And Hallie touched on a number of the features in terms of what needs to be done to better achieve a mandate for change. Alongside that, we need to see strong and effective global governance mechanisms that bring together countries and key stakeholders so that there can be the much needed collaborative approaches to deliver solutions that address the needs that are locally defined and locally prioritized. And of course, we can't pretend that finance isn't an important part of that. That has to be taken into consideration, that finance, well, everybody and everything is asking for money to pay for things, nothing new there. But the outlook as it stands today with financing global initiatives is much poorer than it was before COVID. And this is something that we have to recognize, is that while finance is an important thing, probably there needs to be much more effort around innovative approaches to financing, and also some difficult discussion about reprogramming priorities so that AMR can be addressed. Two other points to make here. We think it's still remains very important to strengthen the understanding of the epidemiology, the transmission of AMR, and the treatment of AMR, particularly looking at the situation as relates to the global south. Kevin pointed to the understanding that we now have that AMR impacts people far more in low and middle income countries than even previously predicted. What makes this, of course, much more frustrating and complicated from a scientific and technical perspective is the situation on the ground is quite different and divergent depending on which pathogens are more prevalent, what types of treatment are available, and the patterns of resistance. We shouldn't let that complexity, though, create some sort of barrier and an excuse for inaction. We need to have better R&D to really inform what are the local priorities so that interventions that are deployed are the ones that are locally relevant while they remain globally important to address AMR in a more joined up fashion. Lastly, there is this requirement that's already been stated for a robust and sustainable pipeline of AMR products, particularly antibiotics, but also vaccines and diagnostic tools to support the use of antibiotics, as well as the understanding of the needs of patients in everyday treatment. Alongside that, though, we mustn't forget the importance of optimized use and stewardship practices. This is an area of tremendous weakness in most of the world. And this really needs to be thought of as going hand in hand with innovation. So how can optimized use and stewardship practices be co-developed when we have innovation of new products? And that is an important element to achieve access. Access remains a critical action to be achieved so that people who are most in need receive the right treatments or interventions, and that the unmet needs doesn't remain an issue that sits off to the side. So I just want to finish by saying that, something that we need to see more of is leadership and championing coming from low and middle income countries. While this dialogue that we're having today is some very important evidence of that, and how they pointed to what we're seeing through the GLG and what will be happening for the UN high-level meeting, there simply isn't enough. And we need to make sure not only is there the space for the leadership coming from the low and middle income countries, but the messages and the voice are heard. And so this is something that I think we need to make sure are part of the global agenda setting and the discussions as we go forward in the course of the next year and through the future. So I'll stop there and look forward to further discussion today.
Thank you, Tim. Dr. Anand Kumar, Anand, if I can call you in, you're kind of one of those special creatures who has made it, and we hope that you will make it completely. So please tell us a little bit about your experience, but also where are the obstacles and where do you see, because hearing from you will give both Haley, Kevin, of course, I know will understand this, but really for all of us to understand, where are the real obstacles? What is it that we as a group should be asking for changes to be made? And that's something that we want to hear from you. Please, Anand.
Thank you so much, Dr. Sunita, to you and your team for putting this together, and congratulations to all the work that was synopsis presented at the start here. And it's a big honor for me to be on this panel and to hear my fellow panelists. So I'd like to give my answer in 3 steps. One is very quickly on bugworks, 2 on the obstacles, and most of my time I'd like to talk about looking forward, where countries like India are not just part of the problem, but a key part of the solution looking forward. And I don't want to lose this opportunity for that. So Bugworks is a company that got incorporated in Bangalore. We work out of CCAMP in the National Center for Biological Sciences. Our headquarters is now based in the US, and we have a small operation in Australia. We work with about 20 countries. This is a global problem. No one country can own up the solution to AMR. It's going to take a It really takes the global village to pull together complex solutions. Bugworks has an audacious goal on coming up with a completely new broad spectrum antibiotic, not seen in many decades, that can work for a whole bunch of gram positives, gram negatives, pretty much covers all of the bad pathogens in the CDC list in WHO. I wouldn't be here today, Sunita, on this panel, had it not been for the support we got from Carbex starting in 2017. And I embarrass Kevin, but this is the truth. We started and we got formed because of the support of Wellcome Trust with him. We then got support from the Indian government, and we are sitting in an Indian government incubator, so we really appreciate CCAM. And had it not been for the fuel and the support and the deep pharma expertise and ecosystem that Carbex brought, we could have survived. So we are very thankful for that support. Very tough road ahead. We are in phase 1 clinical trials, and please pray for us, all of you audience. If the phase 1 goes through, we will be very encouraged to move to the next level, because this is it's covering lots of isolates. We have tested our assets on 14,000 superbugs around the world. Looks good, but long way away from success. And we've just started working with the WHO via GUARD team. So the obstacles for small companies like ours, as you heard from my previous speakers as well, is you can crack the science. You may be able to get some funding to push your assets. You may even be able to get the regulators to come to the same table, Sunita, to say, let's try to figure out the best practices and not we have to do everything. But if the back end is broken, where there is absolutely no business, there is no way I can keep the lights on. It just comes to that. If it takes $1 billion with a 5 to 7% probability, 10 to 12 years to do a drug, and it's a negative NPV, no one will work. As you know, despite all great humanitarian things. So the back end, in terms of the business model, what we call pull incentives or subscription models, has to be fixed. We can't do that in a single conversation like this. It's very complex. Countries like US are looking at rules like Pasteur, which are market pull incentives. Countries like UK and Sweden are using a Netflix type of subscription models. Countries like India are thinking about pool procurement, like we do for TB and malaria. Are there lessons to be learned from, fellow cousins in TB and malaria? So the toughest challenge is the lack of funding. I spend all my time going around the world for funding. We have done more than 300 pitches to all sorts of investors, funders, family offices around the world. And had it not been for grants, we would be, be where we are. So given that background, what do I feel we can do from an LMIC? LMIC is not just a problem. LMIC is where the problem happens and where creative solutions can come from. For the audience, there is an 80-20 rule going on. 80% of the problem in AMR happens in countries, LMICs, including India, South Africa, Brazil, etc., that are probably only 20% of the market when you look at it as a pharma market. 80% of the market is sitting in 20% of the countries. So it's completely skewed, which is typical of infectious diseases. And how do you test it? So my 5 points for the way forward, Sunita, where I think countries like India can play a huge role. And let's look forward. 1, clinical trials and microbiology. And I steal a line from Kevin, right? If you work on tough pathogens in your own backyard, like countries like India, Vietnam, Thailand, etc., you're finding resistance patterns that are far more serious than the resistance patterns we see when we get isolates from Boston or London or Basel, right? So make India a key microbiology clinical trial hub of the world so it can support the global patterns. Try to find solutions that are contextual to the big problems and the big resistance patterns that are brewing in our backyard. Can we convert a desperate, difficult situation into a positive situation where the country itself and the type of talent we have here can come before? Number 1. Number 2, the infectious diseases clinicians in India are second to none. They see 200 patients per day, poorly paid, lowest in the pecking order, yet doing a fantastic job with few tools. Can we understand the use models of novel solutions from our IDPs? 3, India proved to the world that vaccine, we became the vaccine manufacturer of the world for most of the world that could not afford mRNA vaccines. Similarly, we are largest manufacturer of antibiotics, generic antibiotics. So can our supply chain, distribution, manufacturing be used to produce these novel antibacterials for large parts of the world. I always imagine a world, if just India, South Africa, Brazil came together, they would create a large manufacturing AMR footprint for LMICs. Convert what looks bad into something good. And the business model in those countries is a cost plus percentage. We don't need a big pull incentive. Keep the lights on, manufacture affordably, distribute affordably, get a cost plus model. Next, India type of countries have to take responsibility to participate in a global pull incentive, at least per our GDP. Because if you don't participate in a global pull incentive, why will somebody who has spent billions of dollars in the US or Europe want to bring their product to our country with the fear that we may use and abuse it? So not only is your volume high and use model high, but you don't have any mechanics to pay for it. So we have to start thinking about pull incentives. I hope Anga will bring finance and health ministers to come together. And my last point is we need a clarion call from the prime ministers or presidents of these countries that says AMR is like climate. We're going to solve it. And one of the key ways to solve it is to pass very strong stewardship rules. Can we pass a Schedule U for urgent, that says novel antibacterials and antifungals cannot be procured, just like opioids cannot be procured without a doctor's prescription? That Schedule U is required. So countries like India can convert what looks like a bad issue into exemplars that the rest of the world can emulate. Thank you.
Thank you, Anand. Thank you very much for your amazing work, but also your very interesting ideas that you put on the table. So I want to open up the panel. I have two questions that I would like to discuss, and I'm doing this really to steer the discussion towards what I know Haley will push us, and what we need to do is, so what's the agenda on the table? What do we do now? Okay. And how do we move things? So there are two issues that I wanted the panel to weigh in. One, the whole issue of beyond finance. It has come up in many of our conversations. We also go back to what happened with COVID and the drug development that happened during COVID. The issue of regulatory approvals, the issue of clinical trials, the issue of the cost of development. I mean, at the end of the day, one part of it is finance, but the other part is, why is it so expensive? And so is there an agenda that GLG, we as civil society, should be clear about in terms of the regulatory approvals part of it? Who would like to start? Kevin, can I begin with you?
Happy to. Thank you for calling me out on that. So I think that in this drug class, in antibacterials, approval by a major drug regulatory authority is not the finish line at all. It's really just the beginning. And so as Haley mentioned, and work that I've published and others, most of the new antibiotics make it to even a small set of the high-income countries, much less the rest of the world. And so we need to think about something more than just approval. And we've had multiple companies that have brought new antibiotics to market and tried to access the US market and followed that with either bankruptcy, liquidation, or a fire sale, a distressed sale. And so what I want to suggest on the regulatory side is that we need to do something that's not just getting an approval, because the actual problems here are after approval in many cases. And some of the reasons why uptake is so slow, some of the reason is that infectious disease docs, those hardworking doctors Anand was talking about, they want evidence, especially if the new drug is even slightly more expensive than the old generic drugs. And anytime that we make the regulatory system simpler or quicker or faster, we might end up with an approval with less evidence that a doctor wants. And so ironically, we need more evidence and drugs that are designed for global health needs. I think that's more important than some sort of a massive regulatory reform. Having said that, it would be nice if instead of having to get a drug approved in country after country after country after country, that there was a way to simplify that unnecessary duplication.
But Kevin, but Tim, if I can push this a little bit more, because to me, there is the issue of cost, and there is massive cost. There's a transaction cost. There is to move the drug from one phase to another. And when we see drugs falling off, they fall off really at that time when the cost is so high that they're not able to make it to the market. So I asked this because as a group, is there something here that we can be working on, asking for, so that we can improve the process? I mean, I hear Kevin and I hear where his emphasis is, but I'm still pushing this just to understand, is there something more? Tim?
Yes. No, so thank you. And while Kevin is right to point out that the biggest barrier we face is post-approval. That is the area of the biggest failure in the system for us. And we have to think beyond approvals. But I think it's important here, there are 3 Ps that we need to always bear in mind. We first of all need to have new products. We need new policy, and then we need to have the new practice. And that last part is what Kevin is pointing to in particular. So if we don't make progress on those 3 Ps, we're not actually going to have a sustainable pipeline, and we're not going to see the public health benefits that we need. From the Wellcome perspective, we do believe it is important to address some of these critical upstream issues to the practice element, so that we are lowering costs and hopefully reducing some of the barriers, while recognizing these are not the silver bullet solutions. So indeed, acceleration of regulatory approvals would be something that would lower costs overall. And that's something that seems achievable and we should push for. Alongside of that, other ways to reduce cost of trials, and something Wellcome is directly investing in, and we'd like to see much greater movement on, and this is something that we believe is a global good, and that's with clinical trial networks. So we think it's important to have clinical trial networks in the regions, particularly where drug resistance is most prevalent. And this is something that means that better studies can be done, is scientifically rational, but also at the end of the day, it means that the higher quality research can be done that can deliver regulatory packages and the evidence that is most important and relevant to inform what's needed. So this is an area we think is worth concentrating on in the near term that can deliver benefits overall in the system to reduce the cost, and it can read across to inform practice at the end of the day, but recognizing that doing this doesn't deliver results in 3 years' time, right? That this is something that it takes some time to implement, and the actual benefits will not be seen for 3 to 10 years. So I just want to put forward that note of caution in this. But we do believe that focusing on accelerated regulatory approval and clinical trial networks are things that will deliver real benefit and get us on a better pathway, while maybe not necessarily sorting out everything downstream that Kevin rightly pointed out.
Brilliant. I'll come to you, Anand. I want Haley to come in at this point, and then I will come to you as well, because this is my first question. My second one is going to be on finance. Haley, from your perspective, I mean, you have done incredible work on many diseases, infectious diseases. So in your perspective and the outlook that you have, what do you see beyond finance that we should be asking for?
So I think there is a lot we could ask, because the challenge is so big and so complicated. And the whole issue of AMR, that we are sharing the antibiotics with animals and at times also with plants, actually makes it, a big challenge that we have to really focus where we can bring that change that we need. So I think one important thing is, I think I'll go back to the regulatory issue, and both Kevin and Tim said it is beyond the approval, but I still baffle my mind that only 25 drugs, the antibiotics that were developed over like 2 decades, and only 12 are registered in 10 countries. And why? We need to deep dive into those issues and those problems and identify whether we can change. Is it, I know there are issues around fee and profitability and all those issues. We need to segment and find a solution. I think that is important. And we have actually also raised the attention of AMR among regulatory agencies. In May this year, we had the first regulatory agency summit for AMR between animal and human medicine regulators. And these regulators are actually different, reporting to different government ministries in 65% of the countries. It's only in 35, even then, they are sort of not communicating to each other. So we have actually brought them together, and as a byproduct of the summit, we have established what we call, and with the support of the Swedish regulatory agency, regulatory agencies global network against AMR. And they have developed the terms of reference, and their primary objective is actually to talk to each other around regulation related to AMR, and they have achieved. There has been a number of meetings that they have conducted, but we are raising the importance of regulation and the importance of preserving our antibiotics for preventing AMR. I think that is critically important. So I think for us to know what are the core issues and the core problems, that we only have less than 50% of the antibiotics that are developed are only registered in less than 10 countries. I think that has to come into their attention. We need to engage more with them and find a clear solution. The other one, I think, having that aligned and joined forces globally. I know AMR sometimes could be a divisive, political agenda, as we are actually seeing it real time in the INB pandemic accord discussion. We need to engage. We need to have more champions from the South, from the global South, that AMR actually is a main problem in the global South in resource-limited settings and the global North. So I think we need to bridge this gap of that it is a problem of the North, or its imposition from the North, that we have to get more champions. And I think as part of GLG, that is what we are actually doing. And the fact that your agency, Sunita, is also working on this is a critical indicator, but we need more champions.
I agree, Heli. Anand, I interrupted you. Please go ahead. On the whole,
I have very little to add.
Yes.
After this background. Just again from a developer's perspective, Sunita, I would like to see the CDSOs and the larger, the regulatory bodies from the LMICs, just the top 5 LMICs. Take India, South Africa, Vietnam, Thailand, Brazil. Just choose the top 5 countries that are the toughest ones in LMIC AMR. And I'd love to see how they would work closely with the FDA and EMA and give, confidence, instant confidence in developers that we are not just only developing for US FDA or EMA, knowing fully well that the problems exist elsewhere, and I don't know how I'm going to bring it back here. India has passed some new rules called clinical trial rules of 2019, I believe, and I'm hoping AMR is going to be included in that. But we need to see some more happening in the ground. So when the health and finance ministers come together, maybe they should mandate that the top regulators also come together, because otherwise, I'll be very honest, a good drug like cefiderocol has not yet even entered India, right? It's an approved drug. And we are still trying to figure out what methods we have to use to get it here when our infectious diseases doctors are crying every day for access to cefiderocol from Shionoli. So I think while I'm happy to hear what I heard, that there's progress made, but on the ground as a developer, we don't see it yet. So that's one. And two, clinical trial networks. I think this is a very key point. What Tim mentioned, what Wellcome Trust is doing, what GARDP is doing, and Indian Council of Medical Research, Kamini and a team out of ICM are doing is critical. If our clinical trial networks in this part of the world are not strong, you can't create good quality data and add it to your FDA package or to your EMA package. So these both points we drill again because they're two sides of the same coin.
No, I'm going to move to finance, but before that, just to wrap this up, I think it is very clear, and Haley, thank you very much for this work on regulatory agencies. From our assessment, it is very clear that the transaction costs have to come down, and that means more coordination, more information, more openness, more trust. And it's a lot to do with global trust, because there is huge barriers that countries are putting up today, and that's barriers for good and for bad. And I think that's something that we need to be able to work on and work together. But I think the non-financial mechanisms are important for us to keep discussing, because finance is an issue, and I'm going to come to it now, is the hot issue. But it's also very clear that the money is not as yet at the scale that we need it to be. And I want to ask this question to each one of you. It's a concern that we have. What Amit put out is very clear. And in fact, in our analysis, we were sharper and perhaps even blunter about it, is that there is money in the pharma industry, but the money is not going to research and to development of antibiotics. So money is there. We are in a sense, governments today are investing through push and through pull, but the pharma industry is getting, if I may say so, a free pass on this, because their profits are not going to the investment that is needed in a critical human challenge. Now, how do you deploy this? This money is an issue. Do we say, no, it's the market is broken, we can do nothing about it? Or is there something more that can be done which would challenge the money that the pharma industry has to be able to invest back in antibiotics? And I think this is where the question of the global common goods came up, is where the push is important and it is critical to put in money. The pull is important as well, and we can see that there are models emerging in the world that need to be followed up. I think the panel here will be very clear, and I don't even have to pose that to all of you. Those are very important, but they're not going to be enough. And so what more can we do? This is not to discredit what is happening, please. What is happening is very important. And I think from our own understanding, both the push and the pull are very important instruments. But how do you make them universal? How do you make sure that the access is guaranteed becomes critical, particularly when it comes to the pull. But more than that, and that's really my big question, what do we do more to challenge industry to invest back in what is clearly a critical issue, knowing that they will not make humongous, huge profits out of this? This is a class of medicine by its very nature will remain restricted because of the fact of antibiotic resistance. It is a class of medicine which requires access to people who will not have the money otherwise to be able to pay for it. So you cannot plan on your business plan for this. But can you think beyond business? Can you think beyond profits? What is that lever? What is it that we could do? Because that's really what I still don't know, but I am I'm asking this because I think we are doing injustice to the global issue by not pushing further. We cannot leave the fossil fuel industry to tell us what to do on climate change. We cannot let the pharma industry to tell us and get a free pass on this. So who do I begin with? Haley, can I start with you? It's a tough question, I know, but what can we do together on pushing this further?
Yeah. So I think, it's the elephant in the room. Finance, we need it. And we have demonstrated we need it for research and development. We need it for implementation of national action plans. In the 2016 political declaration commitment, those commitments with specific and actionable language were good. And one of those commitments out of the 8 commitments was we commit to develop national action plans. And more than 180 national countries develop national action plan. But it's only 10% who are actually linking that national action plan with resources, with finance. So it's basically, these documents are important in order to bring the action what we want. Similarly, what we need more for the research and development, for the innovation part, because that innovation part is of the 12 antibiotics that have been approved since 2017, only 2 are being considered to be innovative. This is huge. That means we are not getting good number of innovators coming into the field. We are not having probably, and I hear also young researchers are losing interest in antibiotic research and development. How can we attract them? We attract them by bringing a lot of resources and finances. And I think this is a complex issue, but we need everybody's engagement and everybody's role. But at the end of the day, I think those rich nations, the G20 and the G7, in my view, has to take the lead in order to fill this gap. Secondly, we need to have a very vibrant, strong civil society that could actually put pressure on governments and stakeholders actually to prioritize and take this financing issue as a critical issue. And we have to learn from successful public health advocacy and programs like HIV. Remember, we still have PEPFAR getting billions and billions of dollars from the US, government with a lot of support. How can we actually bring the same level of support, bipartisan support and civil society support for AMR needs? We have to work in a much more comprehensive way also to seize opportunities of existing opportunities to catalyze, like the Global Fund for HIV/TB malaria. Can we have a new, or the climate fund? There are also increasing funds available. How can we actually tap on AMR on those? So we have to see all possible options. But I think the most important thing is for the global community, again, to join its voice and forces to say that financing is critical. We need the dollars now. Thank you.
Thank you, Haley. Tim, how do you not give pharma industry a free pass on this? How can we hold them to account?
Yeah, that's a very tough question, and I actually think that we also need to bear in mind that healthcare systems have gotten a bit of a free pass in terms of antibiotics and the true value of them. And this is part of the problem here. And I don't think we can have a discussion about the role of the pharma industry bringing innovative drugs forward and not getting a free pass if we don't also consider whether or not the full value benefits delivered to healthcare are being recognized. And so that's something that has been largely absent from many discussions. It's something that I think was nicely brought to light when the UK went to implement its pilot scheme for its pull incentive, and wanted to try to determine how to recognize the broader benefits, including the externalities of having effective antibiotics available. And therefore, it's not just a simple transaction of how much do I pay to have this drug today, but it's actually how much do I pay to have a drug that is effective when I need it. So that must be brought into these discussions. Also, we believe it's important to think about the financing, just not in terms of what public financing should be mobilized and applied to this, but also private financing. And there is a role that governments have in creating incentive structures that invites back in private investment. So this doesn't need to be paid for fully by the public purse, but we have a situation in a system that doesn't work. So something that I believe can achieve change, and firstly, following on Ali's very important point, governments have to prioritize this as an issue. If it's not prioritized, there's not really a discussion. Assuming it's prioritized as an important issue, a system type change is to have things that are outcomes linked. Let's move away from a situation where it's about shifting product and paying for product on an individual basis. But can we look at this in terms of the outcomes that are delivered to the healthcare systems and to society? And that is something that can actually create a daisy chain such that we can see the value of antibiotics in treating a cancer patient, and that it's an important value to the cancer patient and those other areas where pharma companies are finding it much more profitable overall. If we could do outcomes linkages, then it brings together the whole package so that we're not having separation between notionally very high value products from ones that are low value, as antimicrobials are.
Thank you. Kevin, you want to add to this discussion also in terms of the targets that need to be set? So, Kevin, please.
So just some excellent points that Haley and Tim made. I'd like to just say, we've spent as society a couple decades getting really used to having nearly free antibiotics. And the hospitals have been used to that, and the doctors and the patients and all of us. And now we're surprised that nobody wants to make them for us anymore, because we've gotten used to such a low price that, as Tim said, doesn't reflect the value. So let's think about what different architecture do we want in global health to address this problem. And Haley mentioned, PEPFAR and the Global Fund, other disease groups with equivalent or smaller current mortality in the world have tremendous infrastructures built around them. And PEPFAR, you can think of PEPFAR as a giant pull incentive in a sense, because it provides a market for the products and then gives scientific targets for what we want. And then these products appear after years of hard scientific effort. And so I think this problem is different enough that we need to change the valuation of antibiotics, but we don't want to do that in a way that actually causes the patient at the point of care, especially in a lower resource setting, to not be able to afford it. And the clearest way out of that kind of conundrum, we want this to be higher value, but we don't want the patient to pay more, is this idea of delinkage, which is what the United Kingdom has done with its pull incentive. Breaking the link between how the R&D is paid for and how the patient gets access to the product. I'm hopeful that's the path forward, or a path forward, to making sure that patients get what they need, that the priorities are set by global health, that the R&D folks like Anand don't go bankrupt at the same time, and that we have a system that's sustainable for generations. We're not trying to solve for tomorrow, we're trying to solve for the long term. CARB-X has a small piece in that, an important piece, but not the only piece. We're trying to make sure that in 5 or 10 or 15 years, there's something there for a pull incentive that's worthy of a pull incentive. If the pipeline is empty, the pull incentives will fail. You need something coming that's worthy of this sort of a reward. And that's what we're working on at Corvex.
No, wonderful. Anand?
Yeah, great, great points. So Sunita, this is very, very complicated. I think the equation is unbalanced if you don't have public pull incentives and pharma in the same narrative, right? One can't exist without the other. When I talk to pharma companies, the 4 or 5 that are left who are even looking at AMR, they say unless we see governments doing pull incentives and at least allowing us to keep the lights on in this area, we can't. Our shareholders will not allow us to come in there, right? Number one. Number two, but those same pharma companies are now realizing that a significant minority portion of patients who die out post-oncology treatment are dying because of AMR. Even after the expensive chemotherapy and targeted therapies and immuno-oncology drugs, depending on which country you speak to, it can be 20% up to 30% of mortality in oncology is because of depressed immune systems. They pick up infection, antibiotics don't work. So there is this feeling now that your oncology franchise doesn't show up that well in terms of mortality because of AMR as a problem. It's an indirect connect, Doc, but it's there and it's been proven scientifically. So some thinking is happening around that. I feel if governments, particularly in the LMICs, can give tax rebates to the big pharma companies in countries like ours to say, hey, don't just do generic drugs. Can you invest in innovation because our country needs it? And a big portion of the money you put into R&D, you get as a tax rebate that you can write off where you're making profits in other areas. We have to start using different methods for different regions.
Yeah.
What works in the US in terms of pasture is not working in Europe, where they're looking at giving vouchers to pharmaceutical companies so they can amortize AMR versus oncology. Countries like India may look at pool procurement and creating subscription models. So it's so complex, each country, each region thinking about it differently. But I think giving tax breaks is not expensive. It's not as expensive as a large pool incentives will spur momentum and innovation, particularly in this 80% of the world where you have a very high AMR burden. Unfortunately, I wish pharma companies would think more like NGOs, but they don't. They are profit driven. They're quarter driven.
Nobody thinks like NGOs. They're required to think like NGOs.
Well, we'd hope, right? Given such a big problem that you come in here, but
that's what I'm saying. Instead of a tax break, what about a cess on their profits? Yeah. Okay, so that you would collect the money and then invest it back. So, I mean, that's also. I mean, after all, the world is talking about a Tobin tax. The world is talking about a carbon tax. I mean, there are issues. This is an issue that perhaps requires us to go beyond what is easy, what is on the table, but it's a conversation that we need to continue to have. Sorry,
absolutely.
Anand,
no, this is perfect.
I just wanted to make that point. So
I appreciate
before
that.
I end to the closing, we're now in the last 5 minutes. I wanted to ask the panelists if they had anything that they wanted to add. We have an amazing chat, which I hope some of you have had the time to look at. Very interesting comments being raised, some interesting, very thoughtful issues that have come up. One from Heli Agad, who has said that one of the other ways would be to address it would be through global coordination between R&D funders and what they fund, increasing transparency on research results, really looking at pooling together research so that we don't keep making the same mistakes again. Mehtab Bamji, who I'm not sure how many of you know, but is a remarkable person from India who has led our nutrition work across the decades, is really talking about pharma companies using CSR. We have people talking about how they have options and inventions and innovations that they would like to share. So very interesting chat. But before I just give my final conclusions, Amit, Haley, Kevin, Tim, Anand, Gauri, and Rajeshwari, any comments that you want to add on, anything that you want to say to what I think has been a fascinating discussion. Amit?
So I don't want to add to this very interesting discussion and enriching discussion, but I just want to go back. When I was doing this analysis, there were some numbers that always that struck me the most. It still struck me. I know Kevin has worked a lot on these numbers, but in my mind, if I do a very basic math, and that is very, very high level math, it would have a lot of problems and permutation combination, but still it is something that I would like to say. So we are saying about 15 high earning companies investing about US dollar 125 billion in their R&D per year. On the other hand, we know antibiotic development takes 10 years. Overall, it takes about $1 billion. I mean, there are different estimates starting from $300 million to $1.5 billion. Let's take $1 billion. I'm basically saying every year, less than 1% of the money that the 15 high earning companies are investing is what all is required. Now, I know it's not as simple as that. There would be, for one molecule, successful molecule, there would be 50 odd companies. So maybe you can do 5x, 10x, 15x. But what I'm trying to say is that this is the money that industry is already spending on R&D on a lot of patients, on a lot of drugs which are used to, let's say, for cancer. And it's the same set of patients who their drugs would be useful only if they have antibiotics, right? I mean, we all know the cancer therapies can be affected overall if the antibiotics do not work. So there's a strong reason for me, at least, to think that these numbers tell me there is a very high possibility that if we can put right pressure, and if we can really do the math, I think this call for much more investment from the pharma industry is not a very unsubstantiated call.
Thank you, Amit. Thank you for those words. I think you and I share the common concern. Any other comments before I wind up? No? Okay. So let me just thank all the panelists. Fascinating. I think we've really, we've come together to both share concern, but also with our experience to be able to point towards where we go. From CSC's perspective, and if I may, just tell you why we started our work. Haley, I'm not even sure if I told you why we stumbled on the work on AMR. We're an environmental group, but we stumbled on it because of a remarkable cardiologist in India. Many of you may have heard of him, Devi Shetty. Devi Shetty wrote to us, in fact, came to see me and said that Devi Shetty is a very remarkable cardiologist because he treats his patients at very low cost. And he therefore wants to be able to have high mortality, but at low cost. And he said he's really finding a huge challenge because his patients are dying or are suffering not because of the cardiology intervention, but because of infection. And he also said, and Kevin, this is important, he also said, and the point in India, which is slightly different, is that antibiotics is not that freely available. I think there's an idea that you can just go and buy antibiotics. You may be able to go and buy it, but it is at a cost. It is expensive. It is not cheap in our world. There may be some generic, bad versions of antibiotics which are available, but they're not really available to an ordinary person in India. So let's also get that clear, that the access issue is not something in which it's that cheap that you can go and buy. So for him, the concern was, here are my patients coming from rural areas, poor areas. I know they do not have antibiotics given as over-the-counter and misuse, but they do have resistance. So he asked us to investigate the issue of environment, food pathways, and the rest is history. Since he came to us, we have been pushing away, asking these questions, and have brought many things on the table. But that really does also tell me that we need to do more on this. And I think the overall sense that I have, and thank you, Haley, for organizing the GLG meeting in Barbados with this session, when I heard Kevin for the first time, and Kevin, thank you very much, it was fascinating. And then to hear from you and to hear from the three others to understand that the nature of the crisis, to me, it was a public health crisis. And public health requires public funding. We cannot talk about this just as something where we have a failure of the market and so we have to learn to live with it. We need to be able to galvanize public opinion and to bring on the table the need for this to be looked at as a public health crisis of today and of tomorrow. It's a generational issue. It's a conservation issue of the antibiotics that are already with us. We can't afford to lose them. It's a development issue for the antibiotics that we must get on the table as resistance grows. So I think that's the nature of that's the narrative we need to build around it, so that as we keep looking at the fantastic work which is happening through governments, through G7, through CARB-X, through Welcome, through Push, through Pull, we need to keep nudging, pushing towards a much larger answer to what is clearly, as I say, climate change is an existential issue. This is also a health existential issue. So thank you very much, everyone, for joining us. Thank you, Amit, Rajeshwari, and Gauri, for the incredible work that you have done. And I hope Haley agrees that we will continue to inform you and to play a role to take this dialogue further. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you. Good night. Good night.